Hello, everybody, and welcome to the series Ethics in Caribbean Philosophy at the University of Toronto Center for Ethics. I am Ben Davis, postdoctoral fellow in ethics here. You can find the previous events of our series on Stuart Hall's ethics, Claudia Jones's turn to China, and Chris Seeley's recent conceptualization of creolizing the nation here on the Center for Ethics YouTube channel. Tonight, we will be speaking about the Martinican poet and philosopher Édouard Glissant with Miguel Gualdrón Ramírez, assistant professor of philosophy at the University of North Texas. Welcome, Miguel.
Hi, Ben. How are you? Thank you for the invitation.
It's really nice to see you. We're going to be discussing a few questions as usual and then opening up to discussion of the audience. So for those of you in the audience, feel free to post your questions in our chat at any time. Tonight is our final event in the series, so I'm hoping to create more time for audience participation as a way of thanking everybody who's been with us for the past few months. Okay, so Miguel, Glissant writes about the Caribbean as a privileged space for understanding the present. Can you explain this idea of the import of the Caribbean itself to get us started?
Yes, I feel that there is something in Glissant's thought that brings us very grounded or presents us in a very grounded way to the conditions of what is to think and how do we think and how do we approach philosophical matters among many others. So Glissant's philosophy is interested not only in thinking, but in showing all the presuppositions that are behind what is thinking. And one of them is this place out of which we think, the time as well, when we think. So this is the beginning of Poetics of Relation, which is one of the most beautiful sections, fragments of that beautiful book in general, to consider the conditions under which we think means that, or to think thought, he says, means actually that we have to consider and reflect upon the circumstances. And the Caribbean is the place out of which he thinks, and also many of us organize our philosophical reflections. The Caribbean is, in general, a space that, or a site where all the world comes together for Glissant. For historical reasons, the Caribbean was the first moment, but also place in time and in the world where all cultures came together, or many cultures around the world, because of the colonization of the Americas and the American territories. So people from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, from the Americas itself came together under very different conditions in the Caribbean, and the traces of that getting together are visible in the Caribbean right now. So it's a place where the whole world comes together, but also shows in this coming together fluidity, transformation, movement, and therefore is a moment, is a possibility for us to consider it as the site of thinking, or as a site of thinking that is relevant for the rest of the world. There are other conditions of the Caribbean that are important in the history and in the geography itself. Glissant talks about the impossibility of tracing back linearity, filiation, rootedness in the Caribbean in particular. It might be the case that this is a condition of the whole world, but in the Caribbean that is visible and that can be presented in a more clear way than perhaps in other spaces. And therefore the Caribbean is a moment and a place that would allow us to realize some of those conditions of the world, and therefore think with fluidity in this rhizomatic way that he presents at the beginning of Poetics of Relation, as perhaps it's not seen in other places in the world.
I appreciate that answer and emphasizing the first section of poetics, which I also think about a lot. The emphasis that thinking thought usually withdraws from some kind of place. And I think that's important for ethics as well, because we have this sense sometimes, at least in the US and Canada, where you might go on a retreat to clarify something, or to a monastery, or to the forest or something, these kind of cliches, whereas I see Glissant as stressing this need of engagement that seems different from an ethics of withdrawal.
Yeah, I like this. I like this point. Sort of like withdrawing from, in order to think better, in order to clear your mind, remove yourself from the world in order to be able to think the world. Put it in this way seems very contradictory and very difficult that this would make sense to think political, ethical, aesthetic questions in general.
Can you say more about, I mean, for me, in, say, the history of philosophy, one of the reasons that that introduction is so striking is that we've inherited a tradition where, say, in Book 10 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, ultimately theory is privileged over practice as a kind of contemplative exercise. So, how do you see, you mentioned a number of concepts already, rootedness and rhizomatic thinking and different histories. Can you contextualize some of that in a history of philosophy, and why you see those moves as important?
I think it's important to consider the possibility of intervening in the history of philosophy from an American, by that I mean obviously the continent, perspective, which includes the Caribbean as well. So intervening in that history of philosophy would mean that we tend to think of the history of philosophy as something that was born in Greece, and sort of like evolved into other places in Europe, was manifested at its highest space or situation in Germany, perhaps in France, and then was at some point in England extended to the rest of the world, or exported to the rest of the world. And if we follow sort of like the discussions about the colonization of the Americas, the status of the American indigenous peoples with regard to those forms of colonization, the debate of Valladolid in the 16th century, the idea still is maintained that there is something like thought comes from Europe, and we have to think of the people who are there, but from Europe, or do they adapt to our categories, etc. Part of what someone like Bartolomé de las Casas, for example, does, which is still a European thinker in many ways, is also think from the Americas, or situate his thought from the Americas in order to challenge many of the conclusions and generalized ideas of European philosophy, in particular, perhaps Aristotle, or how Aristotle was taken with regard to the idea of a natural slave and these kinds of things. So de las Casas would root, difficult word to use here, situate himself in the Americas in order to think about the possibility of considering some of the questions, to these answers to these questions in a different way. And there is a disruption there that I would suggest does not mean that we have to abandon these other frameworks or these other categories, that we only have to think from the Americas as if the Americas is a separate place that has nothing to do with it, but is intervening in that history of philosophy from an American perspective. And we can do the same from an African, Asian, etc. perspective. To intervene, to disrupt, and to show the many ways in which categories, European, perhaps categories of thought themselves, have been created through the connection and the expansion and the struggle with other concepts, with other conceptions, with other ways of looking at the world. So that would be perhaps one of the examples. This sort of like debate about the status of the indigenous peoples in the Americas, whether they had souls or not, according to how it was formulated at the time. But we could also think of other elements of disruption in the history of European philosophy that would be perhaps intervened in this way. I think this amounts in someone like Glissant to say that in general, no thought, no category, no philosophy is pure. No philosophy, no history of thought can be traced back to an origin that is a pure origin. Obviously, ancient Greece was also at that time intervened by the dialogue with other cultures, by the struggles with other cultures, by the cultural imaginaries and artistic manifestations of other cultures and other places of the world. So there is nothing pure itself in that supposedly pure origin of Western thought. Um, and the existence of the Caribbean would be able to show this, to manifest this, to highlight this even more clearly for the rest of the world.
That's a great response in thinking through how place conditions and informs thought. In addition to the history of philosophy, one of the things I want to talk to you about tonight is situating Glissant in Caribbean thought. You have an article to stay where you are as a decolonial gesture, where you read Glissant between Césaire and Fanon, so offering neither a reconstruction looking to Africa, nor an invocation of a tabula rasa, but a call for work, as you say, here and now, as temporal and spatial intervention that your reading introduces to us. Can you talk about this situation and also some of what you have in mind with this here now conceptualization?
Yes. So in that paper, I attempt to show something that has been claimed before, the sort of like intermediate space that Glissant would, or Glissant's philosophy were occupy between Césaire and Fanon. I take that intermediate space or moment or space or role perhaps in a different way, I think, to others who have suggested a similar middle ground. I focus mostly in that paper on the spatial conditions of the Caribbean. So how the Caribbean, as the site of struggle, was taken by Fanon and Césaire spatially in a very specific way. That for Glissant amounts to an example of what he calls at the beginning of Caribbean discourse, a strategy of diversion, the colonial strategy of diversion as different from one of return. And so in Césaire, what we have in general, according to my interpretation in that paper, is sort of like a focus on the Caribbean space itself that renders it as rotten, putrid, destroyed by the work of colonization. And this is, I think, manifested in a very visceral way, I think, in the notebook of A Return to a Native Land. In particular, I would say in the first edition, where the conditions of the Caribbean space, the geography, are presented as as rotten. That's the word that he uses many times. The beach, for example, is presented as sucking life, leaking the land, eating life out of the land, out of that island. So the incessant sort of movement of the ocean as taking life away from the island itself. The island and the archipelago are shown several times throughout the poem as nothing, as an incompleteness, as a non-closure that does not allow for the inhabitants and the people sort of like to come together and to organize a society, a community, etc. I don't think that Césaire thinks that there is something essential about the Caribbean that makes it rotten. So he uses these as metaphors, I would say, the space itself. But the space itself, nevertheless, is presented as incapable of being saved, of being rescued from this work of colonization. And Fanon, on the other hand, presents a reconstruction of the space itself, of the geography, and what I think is a geographical approach to the colonial spaces, as also constructed by the work of colonization, and therefore with nothing in themselves that would allow for liberation and reconstruction and a positive creative form of struggle. So for Fanon, there are conditions in the space itself that should be taken, should be destroyed. To destroy the house of the master is also to destroy the house of the slave or the enslaved person, right? You cannot take one without the other. So there's nothing in the house of the slave person or the place where they inhabit that would be offering something to rescue it or to construct it. We have to destroy everything, the culture of the colonized. We have to get rid of all the artistic, religious, cultural practices in order to create history, in order to create identity for the first time, a real identity. I feel that Glissant is located between these two. So Glissant does not think that there is nothing to be saved in this space. He thinks that the history of the Caribbean, and in particular in Martinique, that the history is spatial, the landscape is history, he says. And therefore there is something there that can help reconstructing many of these elements. In the Caribbean in particular, I would say for Glissant, there is this necessity of overcoming the demands of linearity, both for history, what he calls history with a capital H, but also for geography, that I just following that Glissantian suggestion call geography with capital H. The idea that the world can be put on a map, that every single space in the world, every single place can be put on a map, that there is nothing that would withdraw or resist that absolute categorization, cartographization, so that everything is presented there. In the Caribbean, both history and geography of space would resist and enact what he calls opacity or elements of opacity that would resist being put on those categories. And therefore, there is something in the here and now, both spatially and temporally, historically, that have resources in order to construct possibilities of liberation. The here and now in the Caribbean is theorized by him in Caribbean discourse as what he calls the advance of the Americas, or the advance of America. That's a possible translation, l'avancée, he calls it. Sort of like the Caribbean as this outgrowth of the continent, of the mainland, that involves the sense of a risking something, going after something that is unknown, but also detaching itself from some of the practices of the continent itself. So there is a risk, escape, retrace, a rhizomatic sort of movement in the Caribbean itself. And that would be the source of what he calls expansion and movement in the Caribbean, here and now, right? So it's not about going back to the roots, to Africa perhaps, or to Europe in order to find these sources of liberation. It's also not about inventing a new form of life that has nothing to do with what we have right now. It's to focus on the cultures that we have as the effects, but also the conditions of possibility of colonialism and resistance to colonialism or decolonization, temporally and spatially.
I always learn from hearing you talk about this and the Glissant's relationship with time and space, two things I don't always think with or think well with, perhaps. Can you talk a little bit? You mentioned history with a capital H. Can you introduce that to the audience a little bit?
Yes, of course. This is perhaps one of the most well-known motives of Caribbean discourse, that very interesting section on histories, stories, so histories, history, stories, could be an approximate translation, where he basically describes the motive, the desire behind colonization, the historical desire, temporal as well, as something that he calls history with a capital H. Basically, the idea that time moves from the past to the present to the future in a line, that we can trace back those moments as well. So we can, from the present, go back to the past by reconstructing the manifestations and a factual movement of history, and that therefore we can predict out of the conditions of the past and the present, also predict the future, where we are going. He thinks, he doesn't mention this very explicitly, obviously he mentions here Hegel, but it would be possible to reconstruct many of the ideas of the Enlightenment in Europe, for example, as organized around the idea of a linearity of history, history with a capital H. Kant, for example, would be a good manifestation of this idea of the progress of reason, of history as the path of progress, even when it is ideal, right? We're approximating an ideal society and peaceful organization of the world. We're always moving toward that goal. And I think Francis Fukuyama's notion of the end of history would be an example of this linearity as well. So what Glissant thinks that actually we see in the Caribbean is not only the impossibility of history with a capital H, because in the Caribbean we have it was created this out of this, or one of the beginnings of this is the transatlantic slave trade, which is theorized by him at the beginning of Poetics of Relation as an abyss, and the idea of the open boat. And what the abyss shows is that there is an interruption in the history, which makes it impossible to talk about a linear history. So something happened that is evoked by him as something that will not allow us to go back. Ultimately, the beginning of the Caribbean, but this is the beginning of the Americas. What the Americas is today, or one of the beginnings, is this abyss that disrupts completely the idea of a linearity in history. So what we have in the Caribbean is the impossibility to accept that linearity, but also conditions of its overcoming. So not only this doesn't fit, this category doesn't fit here, but we can also show how to overcome the idea of the colonial idea of a history with a capital H by focusing on what he calls histories. So with lowercase h and in plural, which is the histories of the people. And I always suggest Glissant's own literature, his novels and his poems as examples of this history, or these histories, trying to trace back moments, elements, heritages, perhaps disruptions, clashes, struggles that cannot be followed in a linear way. So that's one element there. I feel that there is out of this idea, we can also trace the idea of a geography with capital G, which is this notion of the map, right? Like an absolute map that would be able to put every single space, every single place on Earth on a paper. And this is also behind the desire of colonization and of expansion of Europe to the whole world. Someone like Santiago Castro Gomez, for example, has talked about this cartography, or the conditions of this cartography, the idea of a 0-point hubris, which is the notion of a place out of which we see everything, but that cannot be seen, that withdraws from that manifestation. And in that regard, I think this notion of geography with a capital G would also be disrupted by the Caribbean, by the existence of the Caribbean, because Glissant thinks the Caribbean's unity is submarine, so it's not visible. This is following that epigraph in Poetics of Relation.
Come on, Brathwaite.
Yes, Brathwaite. The unity is submarine, right? So there is something that resists that cartography, that absolute cartography. In space, there is something, spatiality. There is something that resists this history with capital H in temporality and in histories. And what his philosophy, I would say, in many ways, we can trace in many of his works, the traces that go back to the manifestations of a way to grapple with this idea, right? That this idea that there is something in the Caribbean that resists the colonial gaze, the colonial enterprise, even though we can think of the Caribbean usually as one of the places where colonization was the most successful, right? Carried for a long time, extracted. It's the motor of the industrialization of Europe. It's the source of the wealth that we see today of Europe, the extraction of people from Africa, of resources from Africa, the extraction of people from the Caribbean and resources from the Caribbean. So even though colonization worked very well and was very successful, at the same time we see the hope and the source of resistance today and for the future also in the same space, in the same region of the world.
To think with some of the things you mentioned, I go back to Glissant's Mahogany as an example of a different kind of story, trying to say what happens when we look at these histories from the perspective of a tree that saw them in a way. I also, you mentioned the epigraphs to Poetics of Relation, and I've been thinking recently of one way of reading that book is, just as you said, you could read Glissant as between Césaire and Fanon. I'm thinking of reading Poetics as between some of Brathwaite's sense of the new and experimentalism, with the other epigraph he has in that book, Derek Walcott's See His History, and Walcott's Poetics, which is more, as I read it, about creativity under constraint, about working within certain forms and stories like the Homeros, and innovating. That's not the word I want to use, but it's the only one I have right now. Within those constraints, what do you think about thinking of Poetics as through in between, or how do you read Glissant with respect to those epigraphs?
That's a great question, and it's very complicated. I feel that there is something about the marine and submarine tension between the two epigraphs, right? The unity submarine, the sea's history. There is something about like movement here. So you will not be able, obviously, to reduce the Caribbean to one of those, right? To the ocean, as we see it, as it is manifested, but also to the submarine, which is not only the ocean, right? The submarine is also the land below the sea. And Glissant evokes this in Poetics, like both things, I think, in a very interesting way. The opening pages of Poetics of Relation, for those who are not familiar with the text, have this very well-known section called the open boat, where he describes this idea of the open boat as a place that is closed, that is created to house, to limit, to imprison people, and at the same time, it's a space, a place that opens people for the world, for the Americas, the people who are being carried, but also today, perhaps, for the world. So in that sense, we see in the ocean, in the sea, that's one of the manifestations of the abyss. The bottom of the sea, he says, is now planted with the remnants and the effects of these travels of innumerable ships carrying millions of people from Africa to the Americas, from the corpses of the people who were thrown overboard or who jumped, from the chains, from the ships themselves, right? So it's planted with this, the bottom of the sea. There are interesting artistic manifestations of this. We can talk about this later. So evocations of this bottom of the sea and what happens there. But Glissant moves between these two, right? The space, what is below the ocean itself, with the bottom of the ocean, but also the ocean itself, as it comes to the shores, as it comes to the beaches in in the Caribbean and in the mainland as well. So there is something in between that I will feel is also poetics in between Walcott and Redwood. And so in that in-betweenness, I think it also moves something important here in the sense of poetics. I think it's interesting that he chooses these two poets who are also writers, essayists, but are perhaps manifested in this poetic element of evoking the unity and the history of the Caribbean, which are two of the most important motives here. He begins, nevertheless, I mean, the text itself after this by talking about, or at least evoking Deleuze and Guattari in their idea of the rhizome. So this is the first page of the open boat, the first section, which I have also always considered interesting as a way to open the text itself, the book itself, to refer to these categories that were not perhaps considered immediately with relation to the Caribbean. So I mean to say with this that it's not only between or in between these two authors, obviously, but the Caribbean is also in between America and Europe, America, the continent, and Europe. He's from the very beginning not renouncing to think with and through European categories. He's not by any means essentializing or romanticizing the Caribbean as a space in its own. He's not only using categories that were created in the Caribbean, perhaps, but he's also pointing to another being in between that I think it's conveyed in this idea of the advance of the Americas, sort of like movement. Yeah. I have to think about this though much more, your suggestion of the two epigraphs. I like this point.
Yes, not to mention a dedication to an assassinated poet as well. So I haven't spent nearly enough time with that myself. Maybe our readers will ask you more about how you read those poets and Deleuze and Guattari also. But and I would encourage our audience, I mean our readers, to post their questions. Still, I have a few more of my own, and then we can open up the discussion. I wanted to ask you, Miguel, because there is a presentation of Glissant's trajectory in those who study his work that present the early work as more Marxist or decolonial, but clearly political, and the later work in the shift in the 90s to creolization often marking this, or poetics marking this, as too utopian, too hopefully cosmopolitan, that his thinking here with this concept of the two monde, the whole world, the world entire, as glossing over the regional particularities and the struggles that his earlier work underscored. So I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about poetics. I know the book means a lot to both of us, but I'm wondering how you think about his broader trajectory overall with respect to politics, with respect to an ethics.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I feel that part of what I've tried to do by reading Glissant and by writing about his work is also to grapple with this widespread conception that there are two Glissants, and that the latter is unfortunately less political, less committed to certain forms of political decolonization in the Caribbean. So perhaps the idea is, this figure of the young Glissant engaged in the practical activist work of decolonization by creating this alliance of with other poets and people, Caribbeans working in and living in France for the liberation of the Antilles, the Guyana and Martinique and other people, and how he was persecuted and arrested in a way, arrested in France, unable to go back to Martinique, as opposed to the old Glissant who would be like traveling around the world, speaking at big universities, teaching in the US, sort of having this less committed work of activist work and more perhaps the intellectual perhaps distinction. So these two images, I think, I mean, they are clearly ways to understand his life, and I am by no means an expert on his life itself. So others might be able to talk more about the accurate aspect of this character, of this characterization in general. But I think there is something interesting about what he attempted to do in the second part of his life. I think there is an activist, very explicit commitment to a global understanding, grappling with, and denunciation of slavery, for example, as a global matter, right? Not only as something that has to do with the history of America and perhaps the history of Africa, how it's manifested today as effects of slavery, but as something that constitutes a fundamental, I was going to say chapter, but it's precisely not a chapter, element or condition of humanity, perhaps. Slavery as something that has been in with humanity almost always, right? It's almost a condition of humanity itself. So to raise this from a very specific example of this, perhaps the most tragic one, if you want, but also to focus on this globality of this. And so he has all of these public manifestos calling for the commemoration of the abolition of slavery, for the collections of statements against slavery that human beings have done throughout history, the condemnation of slavery today, what slavery means today, and the practices of slavery today that we don't think about, that we don't talk about, that we completely disregard when we think of enslavement in general. And there is something very political about this that I feel would be unfair to characterize as apolitical as this work of the intellectual. So that's one element that I wanted to mention. He has very interesting manifestos with Patrick Chamoiseau on racism, on walls, right? We could apply this to the situation of the United States today, obviously, but we also have to think about walls in Palestine, walls in Peru, walls in the Mediterranean that he mentions in some of these texts. I'm thinking about the short texts like When the Walls Fall, and also that other one that is an address, a letter to Obama called, what would be the translation? The Intractable Beauty of the World, where he and Chamoiseau denounced this practice itself and called for a global movement to fight against and to resist and to denounce the construction of walls, racism, contemporary forms of racism, and white supremacy. That's another thing I wanted to mention. And perhaps, I don't know, I think John Drabinsky has this suggestion in his book on Glissant, The Middle Passage, that perhaps aesthetics would be an interesting way to approach the thought, Glissant's thought, if I remember this correctly. Glissant's thought as a I don't want to say coherent, right? But as a thought that develops and changes, but it's nevertheless political, true and true. And so aesthetics has this political formulation as well that I think in many ways would work. So I would also like to put that suggestion to try to show or to research if that suggestion can be presented in his works. And I think another way to do this would be his thought on relation, relation with capital R, which is, in my interpretation, a political category, and is until the end of his life a political category. If we read, for example, the relation as it is evoked in When the Walls Fall, we're talking about a condition of relation that is political in itself, and that his public manifestation of denunciation of this ministry in France that they are denouncing in this text is a attempt at destroying or separating ourselves, sort of going against this relation of the world, of the whole world, and therefore also resisted in political terms.
And I would encourage everybody to post your questions. I'll ask this question and then turn to the audience. You mentioned aesthetics there, and ethics and aesthetics, while they used to be thought together in philosophy under axiology, or somehow tied to questions of value and evaluation. In contemporary philosophy, ethics and aesthetics are largely different fields. And here I would like to hear more of your thoughts on aesthetics from Glissant, how you're reading that with Drabinsky. I understand you are writing, or have at least have written a lot on, or have a sense of a decolonial aesthetics you are investigating. This would be a good time to hear more about that.
Yes, this is my current project. I'm writing a book called The Colonial Aesthetics that attempts to bring together different branches of thought, traditions of thought from the Americas that are almost never put in contact. Coming to the US has meant for me also realizing the isolation that thoughts created or organized in the US, for example, and how they don't necessarily resonate in South America or in other places of Latin America, but also the opposite. Sort of like Latin American philosophy thought as this sometimes exotic branch of thought from the world that is important, but we actually don't get in the US. I'm thinking about the Black radical tradition in the US, in the Caribbean, the colonial thought as it is manifested in South America and in Latin America, the thought of people in the border between the US and Mexico, indigenous thought coming from North America, but also then from South America. So many of these traditions are not in contact with each other. And I suggest in my book that one way to put them together and to sort of start this conversation among all of them or many of them is through the notion of aesthetics. I make the claim that many of what is being, much of what's being presented here, or the focus on this emphasis on liberation and resistance and political resistance is located at a region or a moment, at an attitude that can be presented in terms of an aesthetic conception of the world, an aesthetic reorganization of what it is to perceive the world, what it is to be perceived by the world, and how we challenge the categories that come with it. How do we also create new categories, whether we create new categories or not, or perception of political organization of community. And I'm interested in showing not only theoretical thought about aesthetics, or what I call the colonial aesthetics. It doesn't necessarily fit every one of these traditions, but also praxis. So consider aesthetics also, obviously, from the perspective of people creating, producing, organizing, and sort of struggling in this field of contestation that can be presented in terms of the aesthetic. And I think because I have read Glissant, and perhaps because I've started thinking about this, reading Glissant, that Glissant is a great example of both of these things. Not separate, or not necessarily separate. And as a philosopher trained in philosophy in a conservative academia, it's difficult sometimes to break this dichotomy between theory and praxis, to think how can something be theory and praxis, or how something practical is theory, or the opposite. So I'm committed to attempting to show this from a coherent perspective, theory and practice, or the colonial aesthetics and theory and practice. And I see this is what Glissant does, not only with his language, with his attempt at breaking barriers between disciplines, between genres, between thoughts and regions, but also with the ideas and the categories themselves that I feel are being discussed in his work. So I don't know, do we have time? I wanted to read a poem by Glissant that I really like. Do you think
That
we
would
have
be
time,
great.
Ben?
For sure.
Awesome. So I'll try to share my screen. I've done this for a year and a half. I should be better at this. Let me do this better. So I share this. And then I put it like this. This is what?
It looks good.
Okay. So this is a poem included in the Restless Earth that is called Ocean, that I think would perhaps show some of the things that I've been trying to think today, and some elements that are part of our dialogue today, Ben. And I'm hoping that perhaps some others will see or read this, and maybe we can continue the dialogue. So I'll just read it. I have been practicing my oratory skills in poetry, but I'm not great at it yet. I'm hoping I become better. The ancestor speaks. It is the ocean. It is a race that washed the continents with its veil of suffering. It says this race which is sung, dew of song, and the muffled perfume, and the blue of the sun, and its mouth is the song of all the mouths of foam. Ocean, you permit your accomplice, maker of stars. How is it you do not open your wings into a voracious lung? And see, there remains only the sum of the song and the eternity of voice and childhood already of those who will inherit it. Because as far as suffering is concerned, it belongs to all. Everyone has its vigorous sand between their teeth. The ocean is patience. Its wisdom is the terror of time. There are many here, so obviously we could talk about this for hours. But there are many things here that I think are doing this work of thinking about the ocean, thinking about the Caribbean space, thinking about history, thinking about time, from a perspective that is not theoretical as the one we're used to perhaps in our very conservative academias and philosophy departments. And in that sense, I think there is something that the poem itself is doing here, or reading the poem, perhaps writing the poem as well. The idea, for example, of the ocean as the ancestor. There is that beautiful novel by Maryse Condé called in English, The Last of the African Kings. I think that's the translation. That talks all the time about the ancestor. The ancestor is the first person who was brought here, not through the transatlantic slave trade, but in a different movement from Africa. The ancestor in Glissant is not the person, right? Might be, but here is evoked the ocean itself. So the ocean is both the one that created, the one that gave way to, but also he says here is the accomplice, is the one that permits, that makes many of the things that have happened. And we see that as well in the open boat, for those who have read the opening pages, right? The ocean is He says, "I salute you, ocean, or old ocean." Um, it's respect, but also the ocean is the accomplice of this transport, of this transportation, right? It's voracious, is the weapon of the death of so many people, the murder of so many people that died in the crossing. And also has left its marks in everyone in the Americas. Not only the communities that more directly come from the transatlantic slave trade, the Creole communities in the Caribbean, Black people in general in the continent, and other people who were also transplanted, transported against their will from many other places in the world to the Americas. Um, so 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 the continent and we, the people of this continent, have to do with this, are marked by this, and are created in a way by this. So everyone, as far as the suffering is concerned, it belongs to all. Everyone, that's an important word. Everyone has its vigorous sand between their teeth. So there is something that we still have with us, marked with us from this history that is the history of all of us. Every time that we, as tourists perhaps go to the ocean, or the people who live in the ocean, or we eat the food from the ocean, or from all of these places, we're eating the, the waste, the effects, the remnant, the sand, the corpses, the blood, the metal of the ocean and how it was marked. Um, and in that sense, I think the ocean is a interesting place to think about history and to do history, perhaps from the continent. Yeah, so this is perhaps just one example that I wanted to share about the possibilities of maybe the work of aesthetics and the political work of aesthetics in someone like Glissant.
I would invite you while we wait, perhaps, to talk a little bit more about um, how you're thinking through these concepts of relation as a political concept, which I've been at conference presentations, and opacity is what I'm thinking relation and opacity together early and late Glissant, though of course in poetics Glissant says he's echoing his claim for a right to opacity from before and these kind of things. But anyway, I've been at conferences where people talk about relation as a kind of post-racial term that glosses over uh, material conditions, historical factors, and instead wants to think through something of a beautiful kind of euphemism of relation. And so anyway, we can listing Glissant in there. So when you said relation was a political concept, that surprised me in a way, or at least it sounds worth taking note of because it's not always heard that way. So could you say a little more about relation as a political? I mean, it's poetics of relation, right? Not politics of relation. So, so what is your sense of that?
Yes, I feel that definitely going or reading Glissant as suggesting that the whole world, tout le monde, is organized around a category that is no longer dependent on national borders, world market, extractivism, slavery, right? Cheap labor, so extractivism of resources and labor, etc. It's a bad reading of Glissant, basically. Not only because of what he wrote at the beginning of his life, but also because of these manifestos that I was emphasizing a while ago, that really make clear that the problem of these walls, just to mention one example, is precisely a political problem. And it's political because it is against that condition of the world, which is a condition of totality. So I'm not sure how to read the notion of relation in a sense that is not intersected by all of these categories. And there is an ethical demand here as well. So it's not only political in this sense, I would say, but it's ethical in the sense that we have a duty with the world and with the peoples of the world to stop failing, he says at some point, stop failing at listening to the whole world and engaging with the whole world and focusing only on one way of looking at the world, which is the perhaps Western, perhaps US American way of conceiving these categories of or these notions. And so there is also here an ethical demand that is by no means, or I don't know how to conceive it as post-racial or colorblind or sort of like globalized in this apolitical sense. What perhaps Glissant is not doing so much would be what he did at some point in his life, was call for a independence of Martinique and of the Antilles, to the creation of a new nation state, perhaps to the many other political tactics and resources that Martinicans voted overwhelmingly against. For example, with Césaire, I mean, in connection with Césaire's political influence in Martinique, just to use as an example. So not to become a nation, an independent nation, but to become a territory overseas of France. So there is something here that he's also listening to, in a sense. I've suggested that in some of my writings that Glissant grew sort of disappointed at that reaction by Martinicans, for example, disappointed at the possibilities of actually overcoming this dependence on France and perhaps create a notion of independence, but also disappointed with the extreme enmity and sort of rivalry between Caribbean countries, nations, and peoples. So the failure, for example, of the attempts of creating a Caribbean federation of countries, of nations, right? That was cross-linguistic, cross-cultural, that failed very quickly because of the enmities and because of some sort of like national cultural disputes between the French-speaking, the English-speaking, the Spanish-speaking, which is obviously a shame. So remnants of colonization that would not allow for a true unity. So perhaps one reason for this would be disappointed at the politics of the Caribbean. He turned to a different conception of the political, which is, in my interpretation, an aesthetic poetic conception that has political and ethic ramifications and branches. But perhaps it's not just reducible to that. So I read Glissant's latter thought on beauty, for example, in those manifestos and in other short pieces as political. That's what I want to do. Sort of push this in the best way that I can.